happy to introduce Pat Welch, KBRA's Chief Credit Officer and Head of ESG, and Bill Cox, Global Head of Corporate, Financial, and Government Ratings at KBRA. Pat and Bill are going to give us a little overview on how KBRA's ESG strategy has evolved and the shift towards viewing ESG factors within the context of management when we assess issuers. So Pat and Bill, thank you guys so much for joining me today. Pat, I want to start with you because I really want to talk about really broadly how KBRA thinks about ESG and how our approach has evolved when it comes to ESG. And really, are ESG factors important to credit?
Thanks, Emily, and good morning to all. I'm really excited to be a part of this session with Bill, where we're going to highlight KBRA's approach to ESG and how and why we think we're different. KBRA, let me start with, is an ESG-focused credit rating agency. Our aim is to deliver the highest quality credit analysis and research to the marketplace. We try to capture and be transparent about all relevant credit factors, and that includes all ESG relevant credit factors. Now, when we talk about KBRA's evolution with respect to ESG, our process has been really iterative. We started with understanding all the ESG credit factors that we'd already been incorporating into our analysis since our inception over 10 years ago. But now we label those ESG credit factors, and we identify transparently how those factors are being impacted into the credit analysis. And we do this really in three different forms. One is we have ESG sector reports, and this gives the ESG consideration sector by sector across all of our ratings. We also now incorporate an ESG dedicated section within our rating reports, and that's very useful investors. They can see very directly how the ESG considerations have impacted our credit opinion. And we've supplemented those things by expanding our ESG research and expanding KBRA's access to ESG data, which informs our ratings. As a next iteration, we're now working to better understand and address potential risks that may arise for an enterprise in the form of future risks, or it may arise indirectly from an enterprise's stakeholders. And how are we doing this? In a word, management. We're evaluating these risks through the lens of our evaluation of the management of the enterprise. We do this in the form of our due diligence meetings, and we believe this approach to using management and our evaluation of management to address ESG is unique and sets KBRA apart. The way we do this is we've added some questions to our normal management due diligence questionnaires, and it focuses on the management of ESG risks and opportunities. We evaluate an issuer's exposure to ESG risks and opportunities by analyzing its strategy for identifying, preparing for, and mitigating the risks. Now, as we think about where we're headed with ESG, I'll make two observations. First, KBRA doesn't use a check the box approach. We don't use that for any of our analysis, and we don't use it for our ESG analysis, which is all the best credit analysis is dynamic and holistic, and that's the way we approach our ESG analysis as well. And this is particularly important because ESG factors are literally evolving every day as market sentiment changes. And then my other observation is that we really we feel that credit ratings that incorporate non-material ESG considerations within the credit analysis itself creates unnecessary confusion in the marketplace for credit ratings. ESG scores can be difficult to understand. They often don't have any impact on the credit analysis. And so by incorporating them, they can confuse the credit rating analysis itself. We're avoiding that confusion.
I think that's a good point, because I think we see, news every day about new ESG products, and a lot of times the ESG factors that they're looking at are pretty subjective and don't really correlate to credit. So Bill, does KBRA have any plans to do an ESG rating score or evaluation?
It's a great question, Em, because it comes up a lot in our meetings with issuers and investors. And the short answer is no. We do not plan to ask our credit rating analysts to step into the fray of creating ESG ratings or ESG scores. We do, however, as Pat mentioned, continue to strengthen their focus on the material, quantitative, and qualitative E, S, or G factors that impact credit. And that's because we believe that roll-up ESG scores by their nature need to be based on a significant number of subjective values-based judgments about how to weight things and how to score them that don't correlate to credit risk. So for example, deciding which social factors to include in a credit rating or an ESG score and how to weight them is so subjective, particularly if you try to blanket an industry with a one-size-fits-all approach. And we think that leads to inclusion of factors for some issuers that may be irrelevant to their credit worthiness and potential exclusion of other ESG factors that may be actually more important. In other words, our analysts stay focused on topics through rigorous bottoms-up credit work rather than a rubric that may give them a false sense of ESG rigor. And that is the way we intend to continue to approach this space.
Great. I want to stay on this topic for a minute because I think it's really important to make the distinction between a credit rating and an ESG rating. Pat, I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about them and how they differ.
Sure, Emily. ESG score providers and credit rating agencies have far different objectives. Credit ratings seek to assess default risk, which really is a financial risk. ESG scores include many factors that often are not relevant to financial risks, such as sustainable development goals, SDGs, subjective ESG impact analysis, personal preferences, and there are many others. ESG scores often require subjective value-based judgments and weightings and often use non-universal metrics. So in contrast, credit rating analysis focuses on creditworthiness, default risk in particular, again, which is a financial risk. That singular aim of credit risk analysis makes it quite different from the many layered aims of ESG scores. Credit ratings are more readily quantifiable. They can be back-tested versus their aim of assessing default risk. And they also have a scale, AAA to D, that is nearly universal and is easily understood. So it's important to highlight that ESG rating providers are also, they're not regulated, unlike credit rating agencies. And ESG ratings across different rating providers often show very low correlation across the ESG ratings. So there's an element of, investors need to be very focused on what an ESG rating is telling them, because the next ESG rating might be telling them something completely different on the same issuer. ESG analysis goes beyond financial considerations. I have said that, and they do and they can overlap with ESG risks and have financial implications. So that intersection is exactly where KBRA is focused, and those things that are not financial or credit worthiness related will not be a part of our focus.
Thanks, Pat. That's really helpful. Bill, I wonder if we can turn it back to you and get a little bit more clarity on KBRA's ESG approach. Pat mentioned talking about management, but if you could give us some more details on how we're thinking about managing ESG risks and why an issuer's management is so important to credit risk analysis.
Thanks, Em. I'm going to answer that first at a high level, then go a little deeper. First, KBRA views ESG risks and opportunities as management challenges. While the magnitude of their impact can vary considerably, we believe that every corporate, financial, or governmental enterprise has some exposure to ESG issues, and sometimes these are potential credit risks, and sometimes they're opportunities. Among the things that we think are more commonly faced by management teams at these enterprises are climate risk, cyber risk, and stakeholder risk, which I'll define a bit more a little later. So whether these issues are direct or indirect, to the extent that they are material, we seek to understand the relative ability of corporate, financial, and government enterprise management teams to demonstrate their awareness of and planning for these issues. And before I go a little deeper, it's worth noting that management analysis has long held an outsized role in many of our methodologies. So it's a natural extension for us to seamlessly integrate certain ESG issues through a management lens. And based upon our discussions with literally hundreds of investors on this topic over the past year, it is precisely this insight into management's planning that is most in need for greater transparency. So let me just go a little bit deeper with regard to the process. And a typical analyst will approach ESG issues in two steps. First, they're looking for the direct, identifiable, and quantifiable specific climate or other ESG related risks and opportunities for each debt issuer, just like every other factor, as Pat mentioned, that impacts a credit rating. And then we write about it. We write about it both in the sections that are relevant in our reports and also increasingly in summary fashion in our management sections of our reports. And examples of these specific direct risks are some obvious ones: a city with significant taxable property value subject to sea level rise, or a utility that has risks due to changing carbon regulation and related transition costs. In a second step, our analysts are examining the broader array of ESG issues that might not come up in that first pass and climate issues by posing questions to management teams such as, do your investors, your customers, your regulators, or other stakeholders have climate or ESG goals or policy preferences that present risks and or opportunities to your enterprise? Let me say that again. We're asking management about their visibility into ESG goals or policy preferences of their stakeholders to get a better understanding of what management is preparing to do to address these topics. Today's news about Exxon and an investor trying to influence Exxon strategies is a great example of places where we would be seeking to understand more about the management team's preparedness for these inevitable issues. And in these discussions, in addition to awareness, we're seeking to understand their planning. Do they have a plan to address these issues and their ability to execute? Is the management team's plan for addressing these issues achievable and credible in the context of their credit rating?
Great, thank you, Bill. That's really helpful. I think it's interesting because a common theme throughout this event has been the gap in investor demand for ESG information and then what actually issuers are disclosing. I'm wondering, is this shift towards viewing issuers within the context of ESG management, is that going to help facilitate more ESG disclosure and really get investors access to that ESG information that they need to make investment decisions? Maybe I could ask both of you that question. I'm not sure which one of you wants to go first. Pat, do you want to start?
Sure. Maybe I'll give a general answer to that, and then Bill, I think you might have more specifics. But one thing is very clear, right? Investors want more information. Now, to the extent that we are going to be focused, laser focused on those ESG factors that are credit factors, there may be plenty of other things that an issuer, information that an issuer has that may be relevant to investors in the marketplace beyond credit risk relevant analysis. And so the idea that we'll be focused on management and explaining the risks that are presented to management, we believe that is going to be a place where a lot of information is delivered to us by management in regards to how they're meeting their challenges. Some of those may be more credit related than others. to the extent that we provide additional information that goes beyond what was factored into our credit analysis as a part of those management meetings, we will clearly demarcate those, and we will clearly make it understood that that added information is simply for disclosure by the issuer and not a part of the credit analysis.
And I'll add to that a bit, Emilie. You know, our outreach tells us that issuers and investors have little interest in a ratings process or ratings reports that incorporate a whole sundry list of ESG factors that are then described later in the report that have no impact on credit. We also do not want the purpose of a credit rating to be misunderstood. So from us as a rating agency and our analysts being very focused on rigorous, ground-up, fundamental credit risk analysis, we believe investors are requesting ESG information that they consider material and impactful to their credit decisions. And in particular, we hope our view of these issues through the lens of management provides more insight and much needed transparency, as you were describing.
Great. So I think we have time for one more question. So I'm wondering if we can shift gears a little bit and think about the future of ESG. So I want to ask both of you, do you think that ESG issues are going to become more important over time? And really, what do you think are the most important ESG issues when it comes to credit risk as we think about the future?
Sure. Bill, do you want to start or do you want me to?
Sure, I'll start. You know, it really varies, from credit to credit, right? So there are some issues that are clearly going to be more pressing, more time sensitive, and more materially impactful for certain credits. But I will answer it in a way that it is hard to imagine that there are too many credits out there, particularly corporate, financial, and governmental enterprises that don't have some exposure to climate change, whether that's direct exposure, assets at risk, or operating strategies that need to change, or investor preferences that are raising the cost of capital for certain carbon heavy industries, whether they're direct or indirect. You know, preferences of investor bases, preferences of customers. These risks are real, even if they're not part of the traditional approach to a management team's risk assessment. So I think climate risk is one of those. Cyber security and cyber risk is clearly another that is already incorporated into almost all of the due diligence processes that we have in place for a lot of our credits. And then I think this broader topic and then I could go on and on about this industry has exposure to this and that industry has exposure to that. Most of the broader array of ESG issues indirectly influence management teams through this stakeholder preference risk. And we see that risk as being almost universal, whether it's a city's taxpayers, a utility's ratepayers, or a company's customers or employees, or increasingly, as we're seeing, a company's indirect regulators. We think that management needs to demonstrate that they're aware of and prepared for the impact that these kinds of things may have on their operating, their financial, and capital strategies.
I'll just add one comment to that, Bill and Emilie. Yeah, I think Bill's comment about the indirect or secondary risks really can't be underestimated. If you think about, let's take an example of a building that is very close to the sea wall, and climate change is going to raise sea level, and so there's a very direct impact on that building, and so that's clear. What I think our firm is going to be watching very closely is the more indirect demand risk factors, demand by customers, demand by investors. So an example of that would be You're seeing it already in the coal and other types of energy industry participants where there's already demand factors hitting them. So, almost anything can be a demand factor. Public sentiment can go in a lot of different ways, investor sentiment, customer sentiment. So it's our view that we certainly need to focus on the primary risks, but the other risks are also crucial.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for joining me today. I think that this has been a really informative session, and for us at KBRA with ESG, as with everything, we are trying to be as transparent as possible and really have people understand our thought process around ESG issues. So thank you again for your time.